Hey guys, tonight we're taking a long, slow walk through the cold stone hallways of a medieval castle. But don't worry, you won't be alone. In fact, you're going to have some very unusual company. Picture this. The flickering torchlight barely lights your path. The walls are sweating damp. And just when you think the place couldn't feel more haunted, you hear a goose. A big, bossy, angry goose. In armor, no, but possibly wearing a decorative ribbon. You see, medieval castles weren't the tidy, romanticized fortresses we picture today. They were noisy, messy, and weirdly alive. There were creatures everywhere on purpose. This wasn't just a matter of poor pest control. Lords and ladies kept all sorts of animals inside, and not just in the stables or kitchens. We're talking about pet animals in nearly every room, on rugs, on chairs, in the rafters, and sometimes guarding the hallway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always fun to see where everyone's dozing off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly through the main corridor of the keep. Cold air kisses your ankles. Those medieval floors never heard of insulation, and your breath makes tiny clouds in front of you. You're trying to follow the distant scent of roasted turnips when suddenly, hiss! You freeze. There, right in front of the stairs, wings outstretched, neck curled like a sentient question mark, stands a goose. Not just any goose. This one looks like it's seen war. Its beady eyes lock onto yours, and without any regard for your dignity, you flatten yourself against the wall. The goose holds its ground. It's doing its job. See, back then, castles didn't always rely on dogs or guards to raise the alarm. Geese were a popular choice, especially for patrolling hallways or courtyards. They were loud, territorial, and impossible to bribe. Unlike dogs, they weren't easily fooled by scraps. They screamed, they charged, and they remembered grudges. Some historians argue whether geese were intentionally trained for guard duty or simply tolerated because they were good at being awful. But accounts survive like Roman records of sacred geese guarding temples, and medieval nobles loved a bit of Roman flair. So having your own honking hallway bouncer, very on trend. You try to step past it. Bad idea. It lunges, honking like a trumpet having a tantrum. You retreat. Behind you, a door creaks open. A servant peeks out and sighs, "Don't mind Lady Agnes. She gets bitey after dusk." Wait. Lady Agnes? Oh yes. They gave them names, nobility, titles. You might even find records of a goose inheriting land, though that may have been a tax dodge. Historians still argue whether certain animal baronies were symbolic gestures or deeply unserious feudal loopholes. You shuffle around Lady Agnes, careful not to make eye contact. She hisses one final warning and struts back to her post like a feathery sentry. You reach the stairwell at last. As you begin to climb, echoes of other animals drift through the stone, a distant bark, a cluck, something that sounds suspiciously like a goat sneezing. The castle is very much alive. Your hand trails along the worn wall. Scratches gouge the surface not from battle, but from claws or antlers, or perhaps a very enthusiastic monkey. The point is, this place isn't just for humans. It never was. You pass another hallway and spot a shallow wooden trough beside the wall, filled with slightly green water. You assume it's for the servants until you see the webbed footprints in the stone dust nearby. Someone's keeping ducks indoors, and that's just the beginning. Ducks were cozy indoor companions for some nobles, especially when it was too cold to keep them outside. Plus, their eggs were useful, and their waddling was apparently soothing. That's subjective. Obviously, you keep moving. In a recessed alcove near the chapel entrance, you spot a feathered shape tucked against the wall. Not a statue. A chicken, snoozing on a tapestry. No one seems bothered. In fact, someone left it a bowl of cracked grain. The line between pet and livestock is blurry here. Blurred by superstition. Blurred by necessity. And sometimes, blurred by pure eccentricity. And you, dear listener, are now a guest in this chattering zoo. You'll see more than geese, oh yes. But remember this first lesson. Never assume silence. In a castle means you're alone. It usually just means something with talons is about to yell at you. So rest your head near the fire, but maybe keep one eye open for the goose. You shuffle sideways past the goose-shaped trauma in your memory and make your way toward what you hope is the kitchen. But instead, you step into a low-ceilinged room that smells like dry straw, salted pork, and flour. Lots of flour. There's a cat staring at you, and another one, and another. 3 sets of glowing eyes blink lazily at your entrance, not alarmed in the slightest. One of them stretches, its tail curling like a quill, and trots toward a burlap sack. It kneads it like it's baking bread. The bag shifts, something squeaks. Problem solved. Yes, you've entered the pantry, or what remains of it. Half the flour barrels have holes chewed through their sides. The cheese has tiny tooth marks, and one cat is curled up inside a crate like she owns the place. Which, honestly, she kind of does. In medieval castles, cats were simultaneously cherished and accused of witchcraft, a real PR problem. On one hand, they were the unsung heroes of granaries, kitchens, and storage rooms, keeping mice and rats from eating through the entire winter supply. On the other, black cats in particular were often seen as familiars for witches or omens of bad luck. Historians still argue whether the sudden rise in anti-cat superstition during the 13th and 14th centuries contributed to later plagues. Fewer cats meant more rats, and you can guess the rest. But tonight, you're grateful for these sleepy assassins. One cat climbs into a mixing bowl, turns in a circle, and sits, just sits, right in the flour. The cook enters, sees the scene, and barely reacts. If she sheds, sift it, she mutters before walking out with a ladle in hand. Another cat pads across the stone floor and vanishes under a curtain. You follow and find yourself in a small side chapel. A flickering candle burns beside an altar, and yes, there's another cat, sprawled on a cushioned bench like the Queen of Heaven herself. This one has a collar, made of linen and little brass bells. The bells jingle as she stretches a paw and rolls over onto her back. In some noble households, especially in France and Italy, cats weren't just tolerated. They were painted into family portraits. They symbolized elegance, independence, and divine favor. In fact, there's an illuminated manuscript from the 14th century where a bishop is depicted reading while his cat bats at the edge of the page. You sit down on a cold wooden bench and listen. The chapel is quiet, except for the cat's faint purring. It's rhythmic, almost like a metronome. You close your eyes, but then you hear it. A quiet clink, then another. You open your eyes to see a small cat paw batting at the edge of the collection box. Oh no, the chapel cat is trying to pick the lock. You stifle a laugh. This place is absurd and somehow oddly cozy. Cats curled in the corners of holiness, monks pretending not to notice. And it wasn't just castles. Even in monasteries, cats were allowed to stroll freely. There's even a famous marginalia sketch scribbled in the corner of a monk's book of a cat having stepped in ink and walked across the manuscript. The scribe just kept writing, probably sighed deeply, and accepted the feline editing. A warm draft brushes your cheek. Someone somewhere must be baking. You stand, stretching your legs, and wander deeper into the castle. The floor slopes slightly. Castles were never level, which is why rolling anything across the ground was always a gamble. As you turn a corner, you almost step on a fourth cat. It yowls indignantly and bolts through a half-open door. You peek in and realize it's the Lord's study. Candles burn low. Papers are stacked precariously. And on the windowsill, you guessed it, a cat. It's staring out at the misty courtyard below, tail flicking thoughtfully, as if composing a poem about existential despair. Or mice. Here, high-ranking lords often kept cats not just as mousers, but as conversation pieces. It was considered slightly intellectual, slightly mystical, and maybe a little rebellious, especially during times when the church frowned on pet keeping as vain or frivolous. But a well-groomed cat in your study, that said you were worldly, thoughtful, probably owned a Persian carpet, probably wrote poetry. You glance at the cat. It blinks slowly at you, then turns away like you've disappointed it. Somehow, you're not sure how, but it feels personal. You close the door gently. So far tonight, you've encountered more cats than actual humans. But that's exactly the point. In a medieval castle, pets weren't cute accessories. They were coworkers, roommates, and spiritual consultants. You return to the corridor. One of the pantry cats trots past with something limp in its mouth. You do not ask, and just before you reach the stairs, you spot something even more bizarre. A woven tapestry featuring, yes, a cat, not a lion, not a leopard, a domestic cat, wearing a crown and batting at a bishop's shoe. It might be satire, it might be real, it might be both, but one thing's for sure. You won't forget the feeling of being judged by a dozen little royalty tonight. You descend a narrow staircase that spirals like a conch shell. Stone steps worn concave by centuries of boots, slippers, and maybe the occasional pig. The air grows warmer as you move downward, and with it comes a new smell: roasted meat, spilled wine, wet wool, and dogs. So many dogs. You reach the Great Hall. It's the castle's main event space, where feasts are held, visitors received, and alliances forged over goblets of lukewarm mead. At first glance, it looks majestic: vaulted ceiling, long wooden tables, a fire blazing in the hearth, large enough to roast a wild boar. But you don't get 5 steps in before nearly tripping over a snoring pile of fur. Under the table lies a carpet of dogs. Dozens, maybe. Big ones, small ones, some with one ear, one with a jeweled collar. There's a greyhound twitching in a dream, a pug licking a bone that's definitely not from the kitchen, and something shaggy and ancient curled under a noble woman's feet like a glorified foot warmer. You step around them like you're navigating a minefield. In the medieval world, dogs weren't just pets, they were status symbols, hunting companions, guards, and heated blankets all in one. The breed you owned said a lot about your place in the pecking order. Greyhounds were for nobility, mastiffs for guards, spaniels for ladies with cold laps and expensive taste. One nobleman seated near the head table is idly feeding a slab of venison to a spaniel perched in his lap. Another knight has a dog sitting on the table, which is frowned upon, even by medieval standards. You get the sense this happens often. Historians still argue whether castle dogs were truly trained or just extremely spoiled. A 14th century English court record describes a case where a noblewoman's dog bit a bishop during mass. Her defense: he's just spirited. You sidestep another pup, this one wearing a ribbon and gnawing loudly on the handle of what used to be a ceremonial goblet. No one seems to care. Beneath the tables, a game of dog politics plays out. A low growl, a stolen scrap, a basset hound lumbers across your toes like he owns the joint, and in a way, he does. You pull up a bench, trying to avoid tails. There's one under your foot, another beside your leg. You give up and sit anyway. Immediately, a small mutt climbs onto the bench beside you and lets out a sigh so long and heartfelt, you feel compelled to apologize for taking its spot. Dinner is being served now. Trenchers of thick bread are ladled with broth. Goose legs ironically make their rounds. Cheese is passed, not to you, but to the hound sitting next to the steward, who gives it a nibble first before handing it to his lord. The hound, not the steward. You watch as one hound, clearly more daring than the rest, slowly climbs onto the dais near the lord's chair. It reaches out a paw. The lord pretends not to see. Then, casually, the dog places that paw directly onto the edge of the roast. You brace for chaos. None comes. The lord merely says, "Only one slice, Walter," and the dog is rewarded with a chunk of dripping meat. You blink. Did he just call the dog Walter? Yes, he did. Dogs had names, personalities. Some even had titles. A few royal canines had their own rooms. One hound belonging to King Henry VII was reportedly buried in its own velvet-lined tomb. That might sound excessive until you remember these animals weren't just pets. They were witnesses to state secrets, nap partners, and war mascots rolled into one. Of course, not every dog was royal. Castles also had a less glamorous category: kitchen dogs. These dogs were mostly mutts and had one job: lick up anything dropped on the floor. They were unpaid, enthusiastic, and occasionally blamed for food shortages. The dogs ate. It was surprisingly effective. You watch as a chunk of pie falls from a servant's tray. 2 dogs immediately dart in from opposite sides, collide, snarl, and then decide it's not worth it. One licks the pie. The other lies down dramatically, as if mortally wounded by disappointment. A minstrel begins playing a lute in the corner. The song is slow. The lyrics Tragic, but the chorus is drowned out by the low groaning of dogs rearranging themselves for optimal comfort. You glance up. On the stone wall hangs a faded tapestry. It shows a hunting scene, noble riders chasing deer through the woods. But what stands out most is the dog in the foreground. Big, regal, with a tail like a feather duster, and a snout turned proudly skyward. Embroidered above it is a name, Leopold. You realize someone immortalized their pet. In thread, on the wall, you smile. Not because it's funny, but because it's familiar. Replace the stone with drywall and the embroidery with Instagram, and the obsession feels very modern. You stretch, yawn, and lean back. A Labrador-looking thing flops down beside you and rests its chin on your foot. It's heavy, warm, strangely comforting. You wonder if it dreams about chasing geese through banquet halls. You slip quietly from the feast, your boots sticky with something meaty and mysterious, and follow the sound of fluttering wings and muffled clinks. The great hall fades behind you. The corridors grow narrower, warmer, earthier. You pass tapestries, storage alcoves, and what might be a servant muttering to himself about a missing ladle. You ignore it. Eventually, you reach a room that smells like smoke, leather, and feathers. Inside, it's dim. Only the fire glows coals red and low, barely lighting the stone walls. But there, perched on a thick leather glove hanging from a peg, is a falcon, a real one. It blinks slowly at you, head twitching side to side in those mechanical, bird-of-prey movements that feel both precise and unhinged. You've just found the Lord Solar a private room where he relaxes, reads, or broods. And this falcon, she's his favorite. She's hooded, too, wearing a tiny leather cap that keeps her calm. It looks both regal and unsettling, like someone gave a tiny executioner the night off. Back in the day, falconry was less a hobby and more a social passport. If you had a trained bird of prey on your arm, you weren't just someone, you were someone important. In fact, certain birds were restricted to certain ranks. Emperors got eagles, kings had gerfalcons, and you'd probably be allowed a kestrel, if you ask nicely. Historians still argue whether medieval falconry was genuinely practical or just aristocratic cosplay. Either way, birds like this were pampered, fed quail, housed inside, sometimes even brushed. The falcon beside you lets out a small sound. A kind of breathy click, like it's judging your fashion choices. You nod politely. She ruffles her feathers and shifts her talons on the perch. There's dried blood on the leather. You decide not to ask what today's snack was. Falcons were often brought inside during the evening, not just because of cold weather, but because noblemen loved showing them off to guests. They'd perch beside the fire, occasionally spreading their wings for dramatic effect. You'd sip your mead, and someone would whisper, "That's Eleanor." Caught a hare with one strike. Falcons also had a way of quieting a room. Their presence suggested sharpness, patience, the ability to murder something with flair. You sit on a bench near the hearth. The fire pops once, then settles. The falcon watches you. A beetle skitters across the stones and vanishes under a shelf. The falcon doesn't flinch. Maybe she's off duty. Across the room, you spot a painted screen. Its panels decorated with scenes of falconry hunts, noble women in pointed hats, birds in mid-flight, and squires chasing after dropped gloves like anxious interns. Your eyelids grow heavier. The flickering light, the soft rustle of feathers, the faint smell of wax and ash, it's all slowing you down. But then you hear a cough, human. From behind the curtain, a nobleman steps out in a linen nightshirt, rubbing his eyes. He looks at the falcon, then at you, then shrugs. "Did she threaten you?" he asks, nodding toward the bird. "She does that. Don't take it personal." You shake your head no. "She's named after my aunt," he adds. That explains the aggression. Used to bite the same way. Wanders over. This is something to the falcon. Raw and red, and she gulps it down in 2 elegant jerks. Yawns and shuffles back toward bed. Alone again. Falcon has turned slightly to face you now. Realize how common this scene would have been. Nobles, especially those in Northern Europe, treated falcons like quiet roommates. Even wrote letters to friends referencing their birds' moods. It's seasonal attitudes. One known example of a knight refusing to join a campaign because his falcon was molting. Imagine that conversation. Right in France today, Harry's having a rough feather week. Eyes and wander the room. Side table lies a book more of a codex, filled with careful sketches in various poses. Arts on prey. Push a finger across a margin and find the ink slightly smudged. In touch. Window is cracked open. Rustles through. Cool and damp. Falcon lifts one foot, stretching it, and then tucks her head into her feathers. Warbirds sleep back into the corridor. Sounds of the feast have faded now, replaced by the murmurs of servants finishing up the day. Paper pots clink. Where is whistling? Walk slower. Beer. Smell hay. Hear a faint rustling ahead. Animals. Take one last glance over your shoulder. Falcon is still there, watching. Follow the corridor past the solar. Falcon and fire have begun to fade into memory. Stone beneath your feet grows uneven. In the middle, suspiciously sticky near a wall where someone or something recently dropped a turnip. Sidestep it. Getting good at this. A low thump ahead. Metallic clink. Sound you can't quite place, like giggling and splashing. Round a corner and freeze. Monkey on the banister. Small, hairy, covered in scraggly fur. Also wearing a tiny red vest and holding a half-eaten plum. Monkey stares at you with eyes far too knowing for something that size. Flick of its wrist. Hurls the plum at your face and vanishes into a nearby chamber. Wipe the sticky mess off your shoulder. To the monkey room. Stumbled into a small receiving chamber just off the guest wing. Currently dominated by chaos. Pages are chasing a monkey who has stolen someone's ring. Third monkey perches on the fireplace mantle like a gremlin philosopher. Something that was probably once a rosary. Stand quietly, absorbing the scene. Medieval world, exotic pets were the ultimate status flex. Particular, highly sought after by nobles who could afford them or afford to have someone else clean up after them. Imported, difficult to train, possible to reason with, hilarious in clothes. Really, adored them. Records of monkeys being gifted between kings. Wealthy merchants. 14th century duchess famously sent her cousin a monkey wearing pearls. Note that simply read, lights, luck. Monkey on the mantle lets out a sudden shriek and leaps to the top of a cabinet, over a small goblet as it goes. Pages sigh in unison. They've rehearsed this. Probably have. Spot a low bench near the fire and sit cautiously. Room smells like burnt wood. Cider. Mischief. Eye the monkeys carefully. Eye you back. Scuttles toward you. Tilted. Reaches out a hand and snatches the tassel from your cloak in a flash. You can even gasp. Already halfway up the curtain. Tassel in its mouth. Glorious. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles genuinely loved these little beasts or merely endured them for fashion's sake. Based on letters, work, inventory lists. Thing is clear. These had range, appeared in tapestries, in doodles, and coats of arms. French nobleman had a seal with a monkey sitting on a throne. Head is in mischief. Lastly, branding. Servant passes through the room. A tray of honey cakes. Monkey lunges. Tray tips. Servant doesn't even flinch. And others, picking up a cake and handing it over. Like this is Tuesday, which it probably is. There's a bell cord near the fireplace, made from years of use. By the monkey clinging to it, detail sticks out. Above the hearth is a small fresco. Grand. Carefully done. Shows a lady in flowing robes holding a chained monkey by the hand. He is dressed in matching colors and looks disturbingly proud. Out. Nobles dressed their monkeys in outfits that mirrored their own miniature fashion dolls with opinions and teeth. Part entertainment. Status symbol. Part social experiment in chaos. Even a surviving tale of a bishop whose monkey learned to mimic prayer movements. Morning. Sit beside him and fold its paws reverently. Evening. Deal his wine. Range. Exhale and lean back. As one monkey attempts to ride a broom like a horse, while another delicately picks the buttons off a discarded doublet. Pages is gently weeping into his sleeve. Helps him. Peculiar tension in the air, a kind of giddy dread. Anything could happen at any moment. Flying candlestick. Anna theft. Spontaneous choir of screeches. Can't help but wonder what happened when these monkeys got loose. Picture it. Formal dinner. Visiting dignitary. Monkey dropping from the rafters to steal his powdered wig. Had to have happened. Feel it in your soul. Monkey. With your tassel has now tied it around the other monkey's tail. One of them looks particularly upset, inventing fashion. Fire crackles. Monkey sits calmly by the hearth now, curled, dreamy, at your breath, realizing for the first time that beneath all the mischief, something deeply human about them. Listless. Rise slowly, carefully to avoid any furred landmines. Monkey blows a raspberry at you. Your waves? Odd, like you're leaving a meeting with a very chaotic board of directors. In the hallway, noise begins to fade. Tug at your cloak, missing tassel and all. And smile. Survive the monkey room. Your journey through the castle zoo is far from over. Slower now, because you're tired. Partly because you've learned that speed in a medieval castle leads to confrontation with creatures, some adorable, mildly armed. Water, rain, dripping. Even the kind of dripping that makes you question the roof's structural integrity is splashing. The chaotic kind you'd expect from monkeys. It's a slow, mick, something large. Satisfied is doing lazy laps. Push open a heavy wooden door. Warm, air hits you like a damp towel. Inside what appears to be a pool room. A literal room with a pond in it. Stone floor ends abruptly in a wide basin lined with river rocks. Water glows slightly with candlelight. Its depths, shapes drift like dream fragments. Bird. Expensive fish. Looks like a koi. Might be a kind of carp, gliding in figure eights, bumping into one another like sleepwalkers. Some castles, especially in the wealthier courts of Burgundy and later France, it was considered both fashionable and holy to keep fish indoors. In bowls, barrels, tiled basins that were cleaned more often than the noble's own bathwater. Isn't saying much. A seat on a worn bench. A marble statue of a mermaid gazes eternally into the pool. Looks like she questions. Fish rises near the surface and stares at you. Stare back. Something peaceful about it. Hypnotic. Barking. Hissing. Monkeys throwing rosaries. A silent, circle of fins. Historians still argue whether these indoor ponds were symbolic displays of wealth or part of medieval water circulation experiments. The room is quiet, in a way the rest of the castle never is. You fish. Maybe some bacteria no one has discovered yet. Lean forward. On your knees. One particularly regal-looking carp. Scales shimmer like armor. Moves with such steady confidence. Wonder if it knows something you don't. Probably does. According to old household records, nobles even named their fish. 15th century countess referred to her largest carp as bishop. Read bits of communion bread on Sundays. Her story, unverified but delightful, suggests a noble in Bohemia trained his fish to nibble from his fingers during banquets. Theater. Damp. Fish circle again. Behind you. Door opens with a creak. Boy enters carrying a small wooden bucket. Comes to himself and begins sprinkling dried crumbs into the water. Fish respond immediately, in elegant little turns. Nods at you. Touch the fat one. Says, wait. Leave him. Ask mostly with your eyes why this room exists. Shrugs. Lord thinks they calm the spirits. Turns and leaves. Swinging. Door closes. Once again alone with 30 pounds of serenity. Horse wasn't the only watery oddity in castles. Earlier nobles often built elaborate fountains, some even heated inside their chambers. Commissioned paintings of mythical sea creatures to guard their pools from evil. One notoriously weird court, a record of a fish being knighted. Metaphorically, full ceremony. Sword and all, sit back. Water reflects wobbly golden lines onto the ceiling. The fish makes a soft plop sound and disappears into the shadows. Side chimes the hour. Then, night. It's slippery here. Fish continue circling. I to wonder how many nobles use this as a therapy session. Talk to their fish, guess things. In them as judgmental priests who said nothing, blinked and swam away. Kind of wisdom in that. Maybe you're just tired. In your head back, stone wall feels cool. Eyes close for just a moment. Warm air and gentle sloshing of water wrap around you like a lullaby hummed by a sleepy river. Splash. Eyes snap open. That one just did a cannonball. Very slow, sized cannonball. Technically, now. Odd to yourself. Probably enough fish therapy for one night. Stand. Stretch. Dance one last time at the sleepy aquatic parade below. That one floats just beneath the surface. It's trailing from its gills. It might be smiling. Quietly close this door behind you and step back into the castle's winding halls. Head. Always. New noise. Growl. Snort. Something very large. Breathing. The hallway grows darker as you follow the growl. Ominous darkness, just the medieval kind. Torch might be 5 paces too far away and everything smells faintly of hay. Yesterday's soup. Boots scuff against straw. Plus a massive wooden door reinforced with iron bands. Inside, exhales. Grumpy. Crack the door open and peek into a central post in the middle of a vaulted stone chamber. Bare, one. Color of molasses soaked in mud. Lounging barely fitting on a pile of old rugs and what appears to be the remains of a velvet curtain. Eyes flicker towards you. Interest. The look of a creature used to having people gape at it and then immediately regret making eye contact. Up inside. Welcome to the world of prestige pets. Most extravagant noble courts of Europe. Screamed. I am richer than you and also slightly unwell, quite like keeping wild animals indoors. Big cats. Cages, no. Be too sensible. Often chained in halls or displayed in courtyards. Trophies. Keep a safe distance. Air is awake but languid. Hungover duke in fur. Spot a long bone near its paw, gnawed to the marrow. Goblet lies nearby. And sticky. It drank from it. It crushed it out of spite. Historians argue whether nobles truly bonded with these animals or simply showed them off like oversized, fine jewelry. Records are clear. Frederick II had a leopard. Henry III of England kept a polar bear at the Tower of London. He let swim in the Thames. Burgundy. Story of a duke who insisted on dining beside his chained wild boar until the boar ate the salt cellar. A page. Ended up grilled at next week's feast. Bear shifts its weight. Chain clinks ominously. A casual step backward. Snorts. Old rumor that nobles believed keeping wild animals indoors made the castle spiritually stronger, that the beast absorbed curses and ghosts. Impressed enemies. Account from a Hungarian court describes a wedding where the bride entered flanked by 2 wolves, whom fainted. Wolves were applauded. Dance around. Has signs of past damage-scratched pillars. Painted shield hanging crooked on the wall. Might be claw marks on the ceiling beam. Choose not to analyze that. Beside the bear's lounging pile lies a silver tray. Half-eaten. Most leg untouched. Charlie, third hat. Bear looks at you. The hat. Back at you. Daring you to ask. Don't. Side door creaks. Servant enters carrying a bucket of apples. Doesn't flinch. Doesn't speak. Tosses 3 apples gently toward the beast. Sniffs. Swats one into its mouth like a lazy monarch accepting tribute. Whisper. Its name. Raises an eyebrow. Bramble. Of course it is. Bramble curls up slightly and begins gnawing a nearby piece of firewood. Splinters. Take another step back. To court gossip from the 13th century, nobles insisted on involving their prestige pets in ceremonies. Baron in northern France once made his bear his witness during a land contract. The priest was not amused. The bear reportedly drooled on the scroll. Took it suck further. The Roman count kept a wild boar who attended mass, wore a red ribbon and frequently grunted during hymns. No one dared remove it. Move quietly around the room. The odd details. Basket of bones. Fur brush. Small bell on a hook labeled emergency. Question mark. Situation is not reassuring. Pause near the window. Side. Light shimmers over the courtyard. Just make out movement stable boys. Perhaps monkey braying. Where? Lee. One is playing a flute. Inside, Bramble has finished his apple and is now licking the stone floor. For fun. Out of existential boredom. Understand. Realize. Strange mix of amusement and unease. Bear is not a prisoner. Part of the house, fireplace. One cousin who never leaves. While most castles didn't have actual wildlife indoors, the ones that did made sure everyone knew. Visitors wrote letters. Artists painted awkward portraits. There's even a surviving tapestry from Aragon that depicts a lady petting a leopard next to a fountain while her husband holds a sausage out to a lion. You step back toward the door. The bear doesn't move. You whisper, "Good night, Sir Bramble." It farts. You slip out as the heavy door shuts behind you. You can't help but marvel. This place is absurd, uncomfortable, smelly, and yet kind of magical. Where else could you see a falcon, a monkey, and a bear before midnight? You shake your head, continuing down the corridor when suddenly, from somewhere above, a piercing screech shatters the silence. It's not a person. It's not even the monkey. It's the peacocks. You freeze, not in fear, well, maybe a little, but in shock. Because that sound, that unholy wail that just bounced off every stone in this castle, did not come from a ghost, a banshee, or even Sir Bramble with indigestion. It came from a bird, a very decorative, very misunderstood bird. You follow the source up a spiraling stone stair, lit only by the distant flicker of torches that can't decide if they want to stay lit. The air grows cooler again, touched with something floral, something feathery. You step into a cloister garden perched on the 3rd floor, open to the night air through large arched windows. Moonlight pours in like melted silver, and in its glow, a small flock of peacocks struts in slow motion across the flagstones, like it's the runway at a medieval fashion show. And then another scream. It's impossible to describe unless you've heard it. Imagine someone stepping on a bagpipe while simultaneously being mildly electrocuted by surprise. That's close. One peacock stands dramatically atop a carved stone bench, tail feathers glowing like stained glass. Head high, eyes wild. He lets out another shriek that echoes across the castle roof and likely into the afterlife. No one stops him. No one ever stops the peacocks. Back in the day, peacocks were all the rage among Europe's upper crust. Imported from India centuries earlier, they became the avian equivalent of a luxury handbag, eye-catching, noisy, and sometimes utterly impractical. Their feathers adorned capes, hats, and altar cloths. Their meat, when served at feasts, was sometimes redressed in its own shimmering skin for dramatic effect. You haven't truly dined until your dinner glares back at you. You sit on a low bench near a potted fig tree, letting the chill of the air settle into your sleeves. One peahen eyes you suspiciously and continues pacing. Another trails behind a noblewoman in a nightgown who walks through the courtyard muttering something about stars and fennel. Neither seem concerned by your presence. Historians still argue whether peacocks were treated strictly as status animals or had ceremonial importance. Some religious scholars believe they symbolized immortality because their flesh was said to not decay. That's probably not true. But you can see how staring into one of their eyes might make you believe in something eternal, or at least mildly cursed. One peacock suddenly launches itself onto a low wall, feathers everywhere. You flinch. It glares at you like you're the one who's being dramatic. The peacocks live here, not in a cage, not in a coop, in the actual castle. One even starts pecking at a window pane. You watch as it pecks again, and then starts screeching at its own reflection. You whisper, "You're beautiful," but it ignores you and continues challenging the glass like it's the final boss. Across the garden is a small pavilion half covered in climbing roses. half consumed by peacock droppings. Beneath it is a marble bowl filled with water. One peacock dips its beak daintily, then slaps its wings wide in what you suspect is an act of intimidation, or perhaps a mating dance. You back away slowly. Despite their elegance, peacocks were loud, messy, and not above bullying children. Records show noble families writing complaints about peacocks attacking servants. One letter mentions a peacock that hounded the baker thrice and stole his belt. Yes, the belt, but still, nobles adored them, especially the males with their jewel-toned plumage and air of haughty confidence. Having a peacock strut past your window while you were writing love poetry. Peak aesthetic. You stand and slowly walk past them. One begins following you, not close, just monitoring. Another stares you down from a planter like a disapproving ant. You take refuge beneath a stone arch, where wind hums softly through carved lattice. Somewhere far below, you hear the last notes of a lute drifting from the great hall. You exhale, and then again that scream. You jump slightly. One peacock has ascended the top of a statue of St. George and declared war on the night. You sit back down. At this point, it's almost comforting, like thunder, or a badly tuned violin someone's grown fond of. You watch them pace, preen, flap, and glow. Their feathers catch every bit of moonlight. Turquoise, gold, indigo, a moving mosaic of aristocratic nonsense. And somehow, in all the absurdity, it makes perfect sense. Of course, a castle filled with monkeys, cats, and carp would also have birds that scream at clouds for sport. Eventually, the noise softens. The peacocks settle. One tucks its head beneath its wing. Another lies dramatically across a stone bench like it's fainted from too much fabulousness. You stand slowly, giving the sleeping ones a wide berth. Even unconscious, they look judgmental. You make your way to the stairwell again, and just as you descend, you hear the faintest whisper of feathers shifting behind you. You don't turn around, because if you've learned anything tonight, it's that every animal here thinks it owns the castle. And to be fair, they kind of do. You descend from the peacock's terrace with cautious footsteps and a new respect for birds with no volume control. The stone beneath you is cooler now, smoothed by centuries of soft shoes and panicked servants fleeing animal-related incidents. The staircase leads you to a quiet corridor. This one feels different, quieter, more private. The walls are plastered, painted a pale ochre, and the ceiling arches low enough to make tall knights reconsider their helmets. There's a door ahead, slightly ajar. A soft breeze wafts out, tinged with hay, dust, and something faintly musky. You enter carefully. This must be a guest room, modest by noble standards. A four-poster bed draped with thin velvet, a carved chest, a woven rug, and wait, up in the rafters, you hear a sound, a scratch, a faint rustle. You look up. Staring down at you with enormous, unblinking black eyes is a barn owl. She's perched on a beam, completely still, head tilted ever so slightly sideways in that eerie way owls do, like she's waiting for you to confess to something. You lower yourself onto the edge of the bed, which creaks under your weight and lets out a sigh of dust. The owl doesn't move, not an inch, and you realize she's not trapped. She lives here. While we usually think of owls as wild, aloof creatures of the forest, many medieval castles, especially those in colder climates, welcome them indoors. Not for superstition, not for ambience, but for pest control. Forget mouse traps. You had owls. One owl in the rafters could keep a guest room entirely mouse-free. Night after night, no creaking floorboards, no scurrying in the walls, just the soft swoop of wings and maybe a quiet crunch in the dark. Efficient, terrifying, a little beautiful. You lie back on the bed, boots still on because, really, who knows what's in this mattress, and watch her watching you. Barn owls were especially favored for indoor work. They were quiet, adaptable, and remarkably tolerant of humans, provided you didn't try to pet them or give them a name like Fluffy. Still, some noble households did exactly that. There are letters referring to owls named Ethelwine and Dame Rook, often with little notes like, "Ate 2 mice and a sparrow today in good spirits." Historians still argue whether these owls were ever considered true pets, or simply working animals with occasional poetic license. but the line was blurry. Medieval people were deeply spiritual and oddly sentimental about animals, especially ones that kept the kitchen from turning into a rodent rave. You pull a thin blanket over your legs. It smells faintly of thyme. The owl shifts, turns its head, and looks away, perhaps granting you a moment of privacy. Through a slit window high above the bed, you catch a glimpse of the night sky, stars scattered like sugar across velvet. You're not sure what time it is anymore. Castle time is liquid, ruled by bells and birds. And then something small scurries along the baseboard, too fast to identify. You sit up. The owl drops from his rafter with a whisper of wings. It all happens in silence. One moment she's above you. The next, she's floating across the room like a feather on a mission. Her wings barely make a sound. There's a tiny click of talons on stone. Then quiet. She flies back up to the beam and resumes her perch. The silence returns. Not just absence of noise, but the kind that feels like quiet. Heavy, total. Owls carry it with them. You lie back again, blanket up to your chest now. You consider how different your room back home would be if it had an owl in it. Less cluttered, more respected. Another castle anecdote surfaces in your memory, one about a noblewoman who claimed her owl could sense lies. If a guest entered the chamber with deceit in their heart, the owl would fluff its feathers and hoot. Her letters suggest this happened often. Either the owl was magical, or she just had very untrustworthy friends. A few flickering torch shadows dance across the ceiling. The owl blinks slowly. You wonder what she's thinking. Is she tired? Is she judging your blanket choice? Or is she just wondering if another mouse is dumb enough to make a move tonight? Probably the last one. Your eyes grow heavier. The room, so still moments ago, now feels sacred. Not religious, just solemn, guarded. Like you're being watched over, not by a soldier or a saint, but by something older and infinitely more patient. There's peace here. You whisper, "Good night." The owl doesn't answer, but she doesn't leave either. The silence lingers, a kind of hush that wraps around your chest like a quilt stitched from feathers and forgotten prayers. You rise from the bed slowly, careful not to startle your rafter-dwelling companion, who continues her silent vigil. Her eyes track you calm, unbothered, omniscient in the way only birds of prey seem to be. Back in the corridor, your footsteps echo faintly. The stones are cooler here, smooth and just slightly damp, like they've been absorbing secrets for centuries. You descend a winding staircase that feels narrower with each turn. The air changes warmer again, thicker, filled with smells that don't belong anywhere near sleeping quarters. You pause at a wooden door that hangs slightly ajar, leaking a flickering glow and the unmistakable scent of sulfur. Curiosity and a slight disregard for your own safety lead you inside. You've stepped into the alchemist's chamber, and oh, it's alive. Not with people, but with motion. Breath, slither, and croak. The room is cluttered. Shelves brimming with scrolls, strange powders, bottles with handwritten labels like bat powder probably and salt of Saturn. In the corner, under a mesh dome, a toad the size of a dinner roll is breathing heavily like it's had a long day. In medieval times, alchemy wasn't some fringe hobby. It was a legitimate proto-science practiced by monks, scholars, and eccentrics alike. And animals, they were considered essential, sometimes as ingredients, often as omens, and occasionally as roommates. A large lizard crawls across a windowsill, pausing under a flickering beeswax candle to bask in the heat. Its skin glistens like wet parchment. You nod politely. It blinks, probably a sign of respect. In the center of the room, a man in a soot-streaked robe is asleep in his chair, mouth open, scroll resting on his chest. He smells of rosemary and burnt leather. His desk is a disaster of tin cups, stone bowls, and melted wax. A dried snake skin curls next to a bowl of crushed rose petals. A note pinned beside it reads, "For dreams only, not for soup." And beside all of this, nestled among stacked texts and cracked crucibles, is a small, shallow cage. Inside is a snake, a small, coiled one, pale, unmoving, watching. You step closer. It flicks its tongue once. You step back. Snake ownership among medieval alchemists was a known, though not entirely trusted, phenomenon. To the public, snakes were ominous, biblical, slippery, dangerous. But to those in the business of transformation, snakes were symbols of rebirth, of shedding skin, of ancient knowledge. Some scholars even believe that whispering your dreams to a snake could preserve them or change them. Historians still argue whether these beliefs were mystical nonsense or early metaphors for psychological introspection. Regardless, the snakes stuck around. You glance around the room again. A crow feather lies beside a bowl of soot. A dead beetle is pinned to an open page with the word "whispers" written underneath in red ink. A candle sputters. A tiny frog in a wooden box lets out a glorp and promptly falls asleep again. There's movement near your foot. You don't scream, but your soul briefly packs its bags. It's just another toad, this one wearing a bit of twine around its middle like a belt. It hops once, then freezes in place. Perhaps it's meditating. You don't question it. You peer at the sleeping alchemist. He hasn't moved. There's a faint snore. You glance at the open scroll on his chest and spot the words, "To turn base into beauty, add frog spit under moonlight." Of course, the air smells like cinnamon, vinegar, and mild regret. You turn toward the far wall where a collection of jars glows in faint colors green, amber, and one ominously labeled "Do not open again." You wisely do not open it. As you cross the room to leave, your sleeve brushes a wind chime made of bone and brass thimbles. It jingles softly, and something rustles in the rafters. You look up. A black cat. Of course, it stares down at you with those impossibly yellow eyes, unmoving, like a punctuation mark to whatever weird paragraph this room was. The cat blinks. So do you? You exit before anything else breathes. Back in the corridor, your heart finally returns to a resting rhythm. The castle feels cooler again, quieter. Though your boots now smell faintly of frog habitat and secrets, you whisper to yourself, that wasn't even the weirdest room, because deep down, you know it's not. Not by a long shot. You walk a little faster now. Not because you're scared, not exactly. But after owls that stalk and snakes that stare and frogs with belts, you're feeling lightly tested and maybe just a little bit lumpy inside, like your soul's still trying to reattach itself from the alchemist's room. The corridor curves gently and opens into a grand hallway lined with tapestries, rich reds and indigos, depicting scenes of hunts, coronations, and one bizarre panel where a goat appears to be giving legal advice to a bishop. You let that one go. Then you see it, a massive wooden door carved with ivy, lions, and what looks suspiciously like a hedgehog wearing a crown. You push it open. This is the royal chamber. The centerpiece is a towering canopy bed, layers of fabric, tassels, pillows, and implied importance. The fireplace crackles in the corner. There's a golden harp by the window. A book lies open on the floor, as if someone dropped it mid-sentence. And nestled among the blankets, the quilts, the furs, are dogs, so many dogs. One is snoring, one is twitching, one, possibly a pug, is stretched across the pillow like it owns the crown that's been set on the bedside table. You step in softly. The royal bed wasn't just a status symbol, it was a community event. Kings and queens weren't shy about sleeping in the same room with half a dozen animals, a few trusted courtiers, a servant or two, and yes, small creatures with names like Muffin or Butterball curled under the duvet. Some lapdogs were literal status symbols, others were heated accessories, with noble women holding them in their laps. Not because they were affectionate, but because castles were freezing and the dogs were, essentially, squishy hot water bottles with attitudes. The Queen of France reportedly had 4 toy spaniels who all slept in bed with her and wore matching silk collars. A visiting ambassador once tripped over one and wasn't invited back. You ease down into a plush chair near the hearth. Immediately, a small dog climbs into your lap, sighs like it's had a long day at court, and promptly falls asleep. Its breath smells like roast chicken and self-importance. You glance around. On a velvet cushion at the foot of the bed rests a hedgehog. You blink. Yep, definitely a hedgehog. Small, round, and doing absolutely nothing. The hedgehog, apparently named Tansy, was once a popular bed pet in some circles. Hedgehogs were considered both cute and practical, excellent for controlling bugs. There's even evidence that noble women placed them near the edges of the bed to discourage lice migration. Honestly, genius. You suppress a yawn as the lapdog sighs again and flips over. One of the spaniels at the foot of the bed is having a dream. Its paws twitch, tail flicks, and it lets out a whimper that sounds vaguely like a question. A side door opens. A sleepy-looking servant in a nightcap enters with a small silver bowl. He places it on the floor. Warm goat's milk. The dogs know the routine. A terrier hops down, laps politely, and returns to his designated sleeping zone. On top of a velvet robe draped across the footboard, you're not sure if the king is in this bed. You're not sure anyone can be in this bed. There's barely room. You stifle a laugh as you remember a historical account of King Charles II of England, who let his spaniels run through court chambers, interrupt council meetings, and nap in his wig box. He famously declared that no one shall disturb the dogs. Imagine being a duke and having to bow around a yawning Shih Tzu. Historians still argue whether all this lapdog luxury had deeper symbolism, loyalty, lineage, softness amid cruelty, or whether nobles were just really into tiny things that bark. You watch as Tansy the hedgehog toddles slowly toward a saucer of cream and then sits in it. No one moves to correct her. There's a smell in the room. Lavender, fur, and parchment. You let your eyes drift closed for a moment, the fire crackling in your ears. The dog in your lap snores like a tiny trombone. And just as you drift, something tickles your neck. You swat it gently. Nope, that was not a tickle. That was a flea. Because for all their royal treatment, medieval pets often came with passengers. Fleas, lice, and mites were not only expected, they were communal. You scratch absent-mindedly and wonder how the nobility ever got anything done with this kind of background itch. Records from the period mention entire days set aside for grooming both dogs and their humans, often using combs carved from ivory or fishbone. There's even mention of a priest blessing a nobleman's anti-flea ointment. It didn't work. You rise from the chair and return the lapdog to its pillow. It grunts. You whisper an apology. You step toward the hearth, rubbing your arms. The royal bed stirs, just slightly. Under the canopy, one dog lifts its head to look at you and in doing so, shifts a corner of the blanket. You see a foot, just one. Someone's in there. You nod respectfully and tiptoe out. Back in the hallway, you scratch your arm again. You're not entirely sure if that was psychosomatic. Still, you've now shared a room with the queen's favorite pug, a hedgehog with a bed allowance, and at least 5 flea colonies. You march onward. Surely, the next room will be normal. Spoiler, it won't. You move quickly now, if only to outrun the psychological itch still blooming across your skin. Past the bedchamber, past the tapestries, past a servant chasing a chicken with a spoon. Don't ask. You round a corner and descend into a narrower hallway lined with deep, square windows and the scent of straw and sawdust. The flicker of a torch reveals claw marks low on the wall. Near the floor, you hear it before you see it. A series of sharp, skittering sounds like claws on stone, quick, close, deliberate. Then you spot it. A ferret. It darts across the floor, nearly invisible in the low light. Long and slinky like a sentient scarf with ambition, it disappears through a crack in the wall with military precision. A moment later, a mouse scurries out, panicked. It makes it exactly 6 inches before another ferret snatches it and drags it, silently, into the shadows. You exhale slowly. Welcome to the castle's unsung heroes. Ferrets, along with their cousins, Policettes and weasels, were the elite pest control agents of the Middle Ages. Sleek, flexible, and slightly unhinged, they could slither into walls, under doors, through tunnels and cupboards, and come back with results. They weren't pets in the lapdog sense. They were tools, highly valued ones. Records show noble families importing ferrets from far-off regions, paying handsomely, and even breeding them in secret. You reach a side alcove, a kind of ferret checkpoint. Here, a small, carved wooden hutch sits open, containing 3 softly snoring creatures curled like commas on scraps of wool. There's a faint odor, musky, earthy, a little sweaty but not unpleasant, more like a medieval candle-labeled competence. One stirs, lifts its sleepy head, yawns, and then flops back down. Despite their reputation as untrainable, many ferrets were taught to answer to whistles. They wore small leather harnesses. Some had names like Pip, Wriggle, or Lord Tailwhip. One German duke supposedly embroidered tiny cloaks for his ferrets, purely for appearances at royal hunts. You hear a squeak behind the wall. One of the hutch ferrets jolts awake, head twitching, nose in the air, and then it's gone, through a hole like liquid fur. You peek through the same hole and catch sight of a secret mouse highway, a narrow gap running the length of the walls, invisible from most angles, but obviously well-traveled. A few discarded oat husks litter the path, and then, like a medieval horror film, a second ferret slinks through behind you. It pauses, makes brief eye contact, then follows its sibling into the gap. You can almost hear the mice holding a conference about evacuation. Historians still debate whether castles were ever clean by modern standards. Spoiler, they weren't. But the deployment of animals like ferrets suggests they weren't indifferent to hygiene either. This wasn't chaos, it was strategy. You spot an iron hook in the wall with a label that reads, "Ferret bag. Do not wash. You do not want to know." Back in the hallway, the shadows dance as a torch flutters. You glance upward and spot something strange hanging from a wooden beam. A sock. You squint. It's definitely a sock. You think maybe a small glove next to it. And then you hear a squeal from a page around the corner. "My slipper. Where's my slipper?" You chuckle. One of the castle's lesser-known truths. Ferrets steal anything. Cloth, bread, jewelry, entire pairs. They hoard like fluffy goblins with poor impulse control, which is why certain parts of the castle contain what are politely referred to as ferret zones, where missing items mysteriously reappear months later. In one English manor, a missing silver spoon was found inside a ferret nest beneath the chapel floorboards, along with 8 buttons, a thimble, and what was described only as half a frog. You walk further into what must have once been a pantry corridor. It's now repurposed into what can only be described as a mouse warfront. Tiny bite marks line the edge of wooden cupboards. Droppings dot the corners. But it's quiet. You feel eyes on you. And then you see it. A pair of glowing beads tucked into the shadows of a stairwell. A ferret, watching, waiting, possibly judging. You nod in respect. It disappears. A soft breeze rolls down the corridor, fluttering your cloak. Behind the wall, the faintest squeal and scuffle echo for just a second. The castle breathes again. You continue walking. One final image lingers with you, an old tapestry fraying at the edge of a stairwell. Most visitors probably miss it. It depicts a battle scene, but in the lower corner, barely visible, is a little stitched ferret. Wearing a collar, dragging a rat the size of a goose, you smile. That little warrior deserves a place in history. And now, on to whatever weirdness comes next. You're starting to think the castle has no end, just layers, like an onion, or an ogre, or a tax document. You pass another archway and feel the warmth of torchlight on your cheek. There's a hum in the air now. Not magical, just barnyard adjacent. You step into the courtyard, or, well, what used to be a courtyard. Because right now, it's mostly chickens. So many chickens, there's no way to count them all. Some are perched on that edge of a broken fountain. Others wander between patches of worn grass and mud, pecking thoughtfully at invisible grains. One looks you dead in the eye and poops with the cold precision of a nobleman signing a treaty. And then you hear it. The cluck, the low, questioning sound of a hen beneath a dining table. You step cautiously across the courtyard stones, past a goat tied loosely to a half-barrel and a duck that seems to be attending court in its own mind. A side door opens, and you're back inside a small dining chamber, heavy with the smell of stew, garlic, and, apparently, poultry. There, beneath a massive oak table, sits a speckled hen, just sitting, like she's paid rent. She blinks at you, unbothered. A nobleman nearby raises a spoonful of soup and keeps talking to his neighbor like nothing's odd. No one mentions the hen, not even when she lays an egg. Plop, just like that, right onto the flagstone floor. Someone casually leans down, retrieves it, and sets it in a small basket already half filled with other warm offerings. Medieval castles weren't sanitized palaces, they were working, living organisms. Chickens wandered freely between courtyards, kitchens, even dining rooms. You needed eggs daily. You kept egg factories nearby. And, surprisingly, chickens had favorite spots. One would consistently lay eggs beneath the same bench. Another preferred a windowsill in the armory. One English scribe even recorded that a hen insisted on laying eggs directly behind the bishop's chair during prayer. You take a seat at the far end of the dining table. A peasant dish is being served: barley stew, onions, dark bread. No one talks much. They just chew, occasionally dodge feathers. Across from you, a young squire gently scoots his foot forward and gets a sharp peck from a particularly entitled rooster beneath the table. The rooster lets out a soft crow, as if to say, "This spot is taken." The squire sighs, and then the rooster hops onto the bench beside him. Okay, now things are personal. You glance around the room and spot more feathered residents, one scratching the corner by the fire, another perched on the back of a chair, and one somehow standing inside a goblet like it's a hot tub. Historians still argue whether these animals were allowed indoors by necessity or laziness. But many letters, journals, and cookbooks from the era casually mention chickens entering rooms, nesting in windows, and sleeping beneath cradles. They weren't guests, they were roommates. You spot a wooden sign hung near the kitchen doorway. "No chickens passed here." A chicken stands beneath it, clearly considering a crime. You rise, suddenly curious, and follow a narrow hallway behind the kitchen. There, stacked along the wall, are small woven cages. You peek inside one and see a hen calmly resting beside a handful of dried lavender sprigs. This was the medieval version of a mobile nesting box. When hens needed encouragement, they were gently relocated to these cozy enclosures until they got back into the groove of laying. But often, they didn't need it. They laid wherever they liked, and people simply learned to check the entire castle each morning like a bizarre Easter egg hunt. Back near the hearth, someone sneezes violently and mutters, "Bloody feathers." A serving maid shoos a rooster away from the stew pot. Another chicken flies onto a bench, lands with a ruffle, and immediately starts pecking breadcrumbs off the tablecloth like a guest who arrived late to the buffet. You take a sip from your mug and glance toward the door, just as a man enters, holding a turkey. Why? No one reacts. The turkey lets out a strange, gurgling gobble, and the man ties it gently to a stool near the fireplace, pats its head, and walks out again like that's just what you do on a Wednesday. You make eye contact with the turkey. It blinks slowly. You blink back. It seems like an understanding has been reached. The presence of chickens in castles wasn't considered odd, let alone impolite. In fact, some hens were even given names, and there are records of noble women writing entire diary entries about a charming small hen who followed them from the bathhouse to the garden. Was she plotting something? Maybe. You step quietly back into the courtyard. The goat is now trying to eat a banner. A chicken hops onto your boot and begins pecking, testing. Perhaps you lift your foot gently. It hops off. You walk on, now with a new awareness. Any part of this castle, your bed, your meal, your boot could become part of a chicken's agenda at any moment. You hear a soft cluck behind you. You do not turn around. You've learned better by now. You've given up trying to predict what's next. There is no normal in this castle. Every room, every corridor, every alcove hums with the possibility that you'll open a door and find, say, a goat teaching arithmetic, or a duck judging you from a velvet cushion. But what you don't expect as you step into the next chamber is reverence. This room is quiet. Stone walls, arched windows with colored glass, rows of polished benches, the faint smell of incense, old books, and rain-soaked wood. It's the castle chapel. You've stumbled into the sacred space meant for prayer, weddings, funeral rites, and, occasionally, storing chairs no one wants to throw away. You tiptoe forward, slow and respectful, and then you stop, because standing right in front of the altar, chewing thoughtfully on a hymnal ribbon, is a donkey, a small one, possibly a juvenile, big, soft eyes, floppy ears, wearing, you swear to the saints, a wreath of dried herbs around its neck. Like it just got back from a medieval Coachella. The donkey notices you, blinks once, and resumes chewing. No one else is here. You walk carefully down the side aisle, past statues of saints, candle stubs, and a stone basin of holy water that may or may not be doubling as a bird bath. You hear something flutter above. Maybe an actual bird. Maybe your expectations dying. The donkey gives a gentle bray. It echoes through the chamber. And then you remember, this isn't as strange as it seems. Medieval chapels were not as empty or animal-free as we might imagine. In fact, animals regularly participated in ceremonies, festivals, and processions. Some were symbolic, some were necessary, and some just wandered in. The most famous of these, the Feast of the Donkey, held in parts of France during the 12th and 13th centuries. It honored the donkey that carried the Holy Family into Egypt. They didn't just talk about it. They brought a donkey into the church, right down the aisle, dressed it up, gave it a seat near the altar, and during certain services, it was even allowed to bray at key moments instead of saying, "Amen." Historians still argue whether this practice was serious, satirical, or somewhere in between. Some bishops banned it, some encouraged it. One account from Bourges describes the congregation ending Mass with a resounding hee-haw. You sit on a bench, the donkey approaches, slow, methodical, confident. It sniffs your knee, decides you're not edible, and gently rests its head on the pew beside you. The herb wreath shifts, a sprig of rosemary falls out. You pick it up. There's a calm here, as if this animal is both acolyte and choir. You half expect it to offer you a blessing. In many rural castles, chapels were shared spaces. A rooster might crow during a baptism. A goat might wander through during vespers. Cats often curled on windowsills. And if a dog barked during confession, well, maybe that was divine judgment. Or just Earl Waggles being dramatic again. You glance toward the altar. A tapestry of St. Francis hangs behind it, arms outstretched, birds fluttering around him. Beside the altar, you notice something odd, a shallow dish labeled "For Pilgrims and Pets," a relic, a joke. A medieval hydration station. The donkey exhales loudly, snorts, and plods a few steps forward to nuzzle it. Definitely a hydration station. You hear footsteps. A friar enters, half asleep, holding a candle. He pauses upon seeing you. Then the donkey, then sighs. "She's not supposed to be in here," he says, though with no real conviction. But she likes the echo. He walks past and begins adjusting candles. You ask, "What's her name?" He doesn't look up. "Glory." "Of course it is." He continues, muttering prayers under his breath, occasionally reaching down to scratch Glory behind the ears. She brays softly in response, then begins nudging a loose piece of parchment with her nose. You watch her with a sort of quiet admiration. She's not just tolerated, she's part of the space. A familiar presence. A creature that somehow balances the solemnity with something pure. In a world where most animals earned their keep through labor or performance, Glory's job might simply be to exist, a soft face in a hard place. You rise, give her a polite bow, and she sneezes dramatically in response. Outside, the bells begin to chime the hour. You're not sure if it's midnight or dawn, or a moment that lives between the two. The friar leans against a pillar. "She'll probably sleep here tonight," he says. You nod. "She's the holiest thing I've seen all evening." He chuckles. "Then you haven't met the duck in the scriptorium." You blink. He says nothing more. You step out into the hallway once again, your cloak catching a breeze that smells faintly of candle wax, stone, and rosemary. Behind you, a donkey brays. Once, softly. It sounds like a hymn. The corridor stretches ahead, quieter now, as if the castle itself has finally taken a breath. You walk slowly, boots brushing the stone with that soft whoosh sound that only happens in the deep hours of the night, when even the mice have finished their arguments and the cats are snoring on barrels. You're not sure where you're going anymore. The castle has a rhythm, and you've been folded into it. You follow instinct more than direction now. And then, a final door. You hesitate, place a hand on the old iron latch, and ease it open with the softest click. Inside is a room, not a chamber of oddities, not a chapel with livestock, not a throne room for peacocks. Just a room. Stone walls, worn rug, small table, narrow bed, and beside that bed, a mirror. Your reflection startles you. You've seen so much tonight, followed feathers and fur, heard howls and hisses and holy brays. But in the mirror, you're just you, blinking, rumpled, sleepy, A guest in someone else's story. You sit on the edge of the bed. The pillow is dented. The blanket is crooked. And there, in the corner, curled up near the hearth, is the final castle beast. You, a half asleep, possibly lice-infested, emotionally overfed, spiritually unsure, fully human animal. You chuckle softly. Because that's the secret no one tells you. Yes, there were geese in the stairwells, cats in the pantry, dogs under the royal quilt, fish in the hallways, and ferrets in the socks. But always, always, there was one more creature in every room. Us. The sneezing squire, the yawning page, the cook curled on a flour sack, the monk mumbling into his bread, the humans, trying desperately to keep a castle running while their chickens laid eggs on the carpet. You lie down. The straw mattress creaks like an old friend clearing its throat. A soft rustle in the corner reminds you that you are never truly alone here. Maybe a mouse, maybe a spider, maybe something with feathers planning a coup, but you don't mind, because something about this castle, its chaos, its creatures, its messy, mooing, clucking pulse makes you feel, for the first time all night, at home. You pull the blanket over your shoulder and let out one long sigh. The fire crackles softly. The wind shifts through a window, and somewhere, faintly, a goose growls. You smile, and sleep comes walking through the door without knocking. The castle grows still now. Outside, the wind hums low through the ramparts, brushing gently against moss-covered stone, weaving through empty halls where candles have burned low and footfalls have faded into memory. The torches are dying. So are the stories for tonight. In the courtyard, chickens murmur in their sleep. A sleepy spaniel snorts under a velvet cushion. A ferret, full from its last mission, curls into its little cloth nest behind the walls. Even Glory the donkey, still wrapped in dried herbs, breathes slow and steady beneath the stained glass light of the chapel. Up in the rafters, the owl blinks once, watches the moon through a slit of glass, and rests. And somewhere, in a quiet guest room on the edge of it all, you sleep too. You curled beside your borrowed dreams and your borrowed blanket, in a room that creaks and sighs like it's telling you you made it. You wandered through absurdity, through feathers and fur, shrieks and squeaks, through chaos and comfort. And now, everything is still. There's peace in the absurd, warmth in the strange, and quiet in the company of creatures who've never needed language to make their presence known. So sleep, little traveler. The castle watches over you, and the goose, for now, is off duty.